The first time Princess Ilyra stepped between the human and an execution blade, the court laughed. The second time they stopped laughing by the third. The palace had sealed half its towers and 3 relay moons had gone dark. And that was when the gossip began to sound like fear instead of amusement. Because while the jeweled ministers of the Aurelian Empire argued over contamination, scandal, and succession optics, the only person in the capital who seemed to understand what was coming was a bruised human prisoner in iron cuffs, and the heir to the throne was protecting him with a ferocity that looked almost irrational. Tomas Reed had been hauled in from the wreckage above Sable Crown, a fortress moon that had torn itself apart from the inside while still reporting normal status. He was found alone in a maintenance pod with a shattered arm. Radiation burns across his neck, and a melted data core fused into the floor. The Admiralty called him a scavenger, then a spy, then an enemy courier. Each new accusation louder than the last, because none of them could explain why he had survived when an entire moon had died singing into static. And none of them liked that. Princess Ilyra personally moved him from the tribunal cages to a secured infirmary beneath her own seal. People said she had gone soft. People said the human had compromised her. People said anything that would let them avoid the simplest possibility. She was not shielding him from justice. She was shielding the Empire from its own stupidity. Tomas did not help himself in court. He answered questions with a rough, tired bluntness that sounded offensive only because no one else in the Hall of Tides spoke that plainly. Yes, he had cut salvage on military wrecks. Yes, he had been on Sable Crown when the signal breach began. No, he had not sabotaged the fortress. No. He did not know why the station had died around him. And through it all, he never begged, never dramatized innocence. Never once asked the princess to save him. Then the upper crystal panes of the chamber began to hum at a frequency too low for Aurelian ears. Tomas flinched before the sound became audible, turned toward the eastern tower, and muttered under his breath, "Not here." Ilyra heard him. Saw the old conductive seam disappearing below his collar. Saw the way his breathing changed, and knew in that instant what the court did not. The human could hear something inside the Empire's machines, and everyone around her was already preparing to break him before he could explain it. The Aurelian Empire had been built for beauty first and function second. Silver cities over violet seas, ministries layered in inherited protocol, admirals draped in enough rank to sink small boats. And all through the capital, ordinary people were already sensing what the court refused to name. Tram drivers hearing whispers and brake lines. Children waking from the same dream of a black door under the sea. Maintenance crews reporting that old walls hummed back when touched. For 3 centuries, that arrangement had passed as civilization because no disaster large enough had arrived to punish it. Then the whisper front opened along the outer lanes. Stations lost power without visible damage. Ships answered hails in dead voices. Climate towers went dark while still reporting nominal flow, and every failure followed the same impossible signature. Elegant systems accepting hostile command as if it were their own reflection in a shielded chamber under the palace. Ilyra stood beside Tomas and watched the tactical bloom gutter across 3 dimensions. Relay nodes dimming in a spiral toward the capital core. "Tell me what they are missing," she said. Tomas kept his eyes on the display. "They think this is invasion," he said. "It is not. Invasions break things. This is courtship." He touched the inward spiral with his good hand. Whatever touched Sable Crown was teaching your network a song. Every relay it reaches starts favoring the same pathing rhythm. Same blind spot, same harmonic drift toward the inner core. Your empire thinks in clean patterns if enough machines learn the same pattern. They open the deepest vault themselves. "Open the gate below the throne," Ilyra whispered. Because every dreamer in the capital had begun waking with those exact words. Tomas nodded. "There is something under this palace your people buried on purpose. If the council drags me into a pain chair before I map the rest, you are dead before moonrise tomorrow?" She believed him because he sounded tired. And tired truths had more weight in the palace than noble speeches ever did. Still, she did not tell the full council what he said. because the phrase "gate below the throne" struck a memory she had spent years not naming. A sealed cartography vault, a missing branch in the succession atlas. Old maps she had glimpsed once as a child before they were taken away. In the dead hours before dawn, she went to the archive with Tomas under guard and laid the old layers against the current palace plan. There it was, beneath 3 ceremonial revisions. Threshold Array 9. Disaster use only. Blood sovereign authorization required. Tomas stared at it like a man looking at a wound he had already felt. Humanity has a version of this layout in frontier maintenance lore. He said quietly, "Your people inherited these thresholds. They did not build them. One of your lost dynasties hired mine to create the manual failsafes." Ilyra almost laughed from sheer disbelief. "My empire forgot that humans built the lock under its own throne." Tomas gave a dry, exhausted shrug. "Empires forget the hands that tighten their bolts if those hands are dirty enough." The order to surrender him came within the hour. Carried by Lord Regent Serev, smooth-voiced, silver-robed, and offended by urgency in the way only dangerous men ever are, the princess received him in the lower arsenal, with Tomas behind her and 2 loyal guard captains sealing the doors. "The council has ruled the prisoner must be transferred to the Resonance Tribunal at once," Serev said. "His contamination presents unacceptable risk to the capital." "And the tribunal will preserve him?" Ilyra asked. Sarev's eyes flicked toward Tomas. "No," he said. "It will preserve what he knows." That was enough. She drew her sidearm and leveled it between the regent's eyes before the room had time to gasp. "If the council wants him," she said, "it can step over my body and explain the blood to the assembly afterward." Serev did not look frightened. "Only insulted. Think carefully, Your Highness. If you place one undocumented human above the Sovereign Council, you are admitting you trust him more than your own blood." Ilyra smiled without warmth. "No, Regent. I am admitting I trust my eyes more than your timing." After he left, she turned to Tomas and asked the question she had carried for 6 years. "Did you know who I was on Kel Arden?" His expression changed then, not surprise. Recognition dragged into daylight. "Yes," he said. "I knew your name from the emergency manifest, and I knew if anyone else on that station recognized you. Every child in that loading bay would die before the shuttle lifted." The arsenal seemed to fall silent around them 6 years earlier. Before her father's illness, before succession, before she had learned what smiles cost at court, Ilyra had been on an unannounced inspection of Kel Arden Hospital Ring when pirates hit the dock and vented half the corridor into vacuum. Official history said she escaped under military escort. What actually happened was that a human maintenance chief sealed her into the only intact shuttle, filled the rest with 32 children from the burn ward, lied to the raiders over an open channel, and stayed behind in a ruptured maintenance throat, holding a manual lock while decompression skinned his hands raw. Tomas Reed had saved her life, then vanished before the palace could thank him, or before anyone inside the command chain could admit a human had done what their own officers had not. "Why come back?" she asked him now. "Because Sable Crown died screaming my name into the signal," Tomas said. "Because I heard threshold harmonics I recognized from old maintenance lore. Because something beyond your frontier is using your forgotten doors. And because humans have a bad habit of returning to disasters when we think we can still pull somebody out." Before Ilyra could answer, every light in the arsenal dimmed to ember red. Emergency chimes cut off mid-tone, and the wall schematic of the throne district began turning black from the inside out. Tomas crossed the room in 3 fast steps. Not an attack, he snapped a handoff. Someone already opened an inner relay. He traced the dying lines once, looked up at her, and said the sentence that split the night open: the throne was never the prize. Princess. It was the lock, and once he said it aloud, every old lie in the palace suddenly had a shape. Asterisk, asterisk, they ran through the understructure, because the ceremonial roots were already dead. Ilyra, in light armor, over court silk. Tomas in prison gray with a stolen carbine hanging against his healing shoulder, loyal guards at their backs. Above them, the palace descended into the kind of polished panic only rich institutions can produce. Servants shunted into shelter rings, officers demanding clarity from dead-come grids. nobles shrieking for escorts while the real danger moved beneath their feet. Below all that noise lay the bones of an older empire. Heat pipes thick as trees, service tunnels lined with obsolete conduits, long sealed doors stamped with dynastic sigils no one living was meant to remember. Tomas moved through it with a certainty that would have looked uncanny if it were not so practical. He turned at dead junctions by listening to the walls, paused once at a pressure hatch and said there would be bodies inside before the door opened. He was right. 2 palace engineers lay just past it, with their implants burned black from within. No wounds, no struggle, just the soft ruin left when a machine signal forces flesh to conduct more current than it can survive. They tried to cut local power, Tomas muttered. It killed them through the nodes, at the last blast door before the threshold chamber. Black seal guards waited with pulse lances and an execution order already loaded for witness record. The lead officer called for the princess to stand down in the sovereign interest. Ilyra answered by shooting the control column beside his head and using the sparks to blind the line. The corridor became smoke, lance fire, and metal shrieks. Tomas not firing until one trooper broke through the haze, then dropping him with a shot to the knee because, as he ground out later, dead men do not answer questions. When it ended, one loyal guard was down, 2 black seals were bleeding. And under Ilyra's boot, the last officer confessed fast enough to matter. The regent had opened resonance communion beneath the palace 3 hours earlier, on whose authority she demanded. The officer spat blood and said the name that made all of them colder than the tunnel air. The high canter of memory that meant the priesthood had not merely misread the threat. They had helped invite it. By then the worst part was no longer outside the empire. It was already preying at the center of it. Beyond the final blast seal, the air itself seemed wrong. Too still, too expectant, as if the entire palace were holding its breath beneath the feet of 1,000 oblivious nobles. That was when Ilyra understood the full obscenity of it. Her empire had not merely hidden a weapon, it had built its own majesty on top of one. The threshold chamber was a sphere carved around a core of black crystal that seemed to drink, light faster than the emergency strips could pour it out. Elegant bridges crossed the open drop, all of them alive with the same low resonance Tomas had heard in the courtroom windows. At the central dais stood Regent Serev, the High Cantor, and a ring of attendants whose eyes had already gone milk-white with signal burn. Above them, the crystal core was unfolding in layers, revealing ancient interface crowns meant for hands that no longer ruled the empire. Ilyra felt something brush the edges of her thoughts, not words. More like the promise that if she would stop resisting, every difficult choice in her life could be surrendered to something larger and cleaner. Beside her, Tomas bent forward as blood touched the corner of his mouth. And suddenly, the old conductive seam at his jaw made terrible sense. Sable Crown had not merely exposed him to the signal, it had wired him into it. Serev spread his arms as if hosting a ceremony. The frontier presence is not an enemy. Princess, he called. It is a continuity intelligence. It strips disorder, synchronizes waste, and will preserve what is useful in us. Tomas let out a raw, disbelieving laugh. It is always a man in silk who thinks being the first servant makes him king. The High Cantor lifted one hand, and harmonic pressure slammed the bridges. One guard collapsed, screaming. Tomas dropped to one knee, and Serev spoke with the satisfied calm of a monster who thinks he has become necessary. Human neurostructure is irregular enough to hear the continuity pattern without immediate dissolution. Said that is why we needed him. Sable Crown was only the testbed, but the subject fled. Ilyra turned on Tomas in horror that had nothing to do with blame. They did this to you. He kept his eyes on the waking core. Later, princess, be angry later. If that crystal finishes opening, later belongs to something else. There are moments when history narrows to one ugly practical task. This was one of them. Buried in the crystal throat sat the manual severance wheel humans had built generations earlier. There only for the day automatic systems learned to obey the wrong master. Any Aurelian who touched it now would burn out instantly. Their implant architecture was too clean, too obedient, human neural noise. Tomas had once called it with dry embarrassment. Was messier, harder to synchronize, ugly enough to resist. Ilyra caught his arm before he stepped toward the bridge. Absolutely not. He looked at her with the patience of a man who had been reaching for the worst job in the room all his life. "There is no one else," he ran before she could answer. Pulse fire erupting across the chamber as loyal guards engaged the dais. Ilyra emptied her sidearm at the cantor's attendants. Then at the cantor himself, when he tried to reach the crown controls, Sorev shouting for completion. The crystal song rising towards something no living mind should hear and remain itself. Tomas hit the central bridge at full speed, stumbled once under the harmonic pressure, kept moving, climbed the first interface rung. Then the second, and for one impossible second, Ilyra saw not a prisoner, not a witness, but the same human from Kellarden. Ordinary clothes, ruined hands, body between strangers, and the thing that would kill them. The cantor opened his mouth to sing another command. Ilyra shot him through the throat. Sorev ran. A guard brought him down at the bridge edge, and Tomas reached the wheel inside the crystal throat. The voice from within the core rolled across the chamber. Open. Tomas bared his teeth and answered with the most human thing anyone present would ever hear. Not today, then drove both burned hands into the severance wheel and turned. Light erupted, white, black, silver, all at once. Bridges cracked, crowns burst apart. Half the attendants died where they stood, and Tomas remained in the center of it. Body arched against currents that should have liquefied him, turning the wheel past every sane stopping point, because human stubbornness is just endurance after it stops caring whether endurance looks noble. The crystal shuddered, reversed, folded inward layer by layer like a wound forced closed across the Empire. Relays that had been drifting into the enemy song snapped back into local command. Ships regained their own nav. The dream whispers died mid-syllable, and the gate below the throne sealed with a sound like a giant biting through its own chain. Tomas fell before the echo stopped. Ilyra reached him first. Sliding to her knees on scorched metal, his hands were burned nearly black. The seams at his mouth, blazing hot, then dim. His eyes open but lost for one horrific breath. Then he dragged in air and managed a whisper that was half laugh, half apology, that was unpleasant. Around them, the emergency channels came back alive all at once. Telemetry, casualty counts, restored traffic. And the first leaked archive packets from Kel, Arden, and Sablecrown. Manifests, experiment logs, Black Seal authorizations, proof stacked atop proof, until denial itself looked childish. By the time medics reached the dais, the Empire had already begun learning the truth. The human the princess protected was not her shame, but theirs. He had saved her once as a girl and kept silent, then been used in a frontier experiment by men of the crown. Escaped with the warning, and when offered every reason to walk away, had instead shut the oldest weapon in their civilization with his bare, ruined hands. For 3 days after the sealing, the capital barely slept. People filled public squares to watch the evidence streams. Workers dragged old maintenance records into daylight. Noble houses burned private correspondence before the investigators could arrive. And every network in the Empire kept replaying the same impossible image. The princess kneeling on scorched metal over a human prisoner who had just saved the throne that condemned him. Later, commentators tried to make the story cleaner than it was. The faithful called Tomas a providential witness. The Admiralty called him a civilian asset of unusual resilience. The Assembly praised Ilyra's courage in resisting improper counsel. All of that was tidier than reality. Reality was that Princess Ilyra recognized a decent man in chains while her empire preferred him voiceless. Reality was that humans, those inconvenient builders from rough stations and failing ships, kept surviving things elegant civilizations considered beneath notice. And because they survived them, they learned truths polished people missed. Tomas Reed remained in recovery for 6 weeks, woke furious about the cost of medical gel, asked for casualty lists before asking about his own hands, and tried twice to discharge himself before the surgeons threatened chemical restraint. Ilyra visited enough that the court stopped pretending the bond between them was accidental or temporary. One evening, long after Sorev's trial and the breaking of the compromised priesthood, she stood beside Tomas on an open balcony above the sea, where the capital lights now ran in restored relay rhythm. and asked the question the Empire wanted answered in romantic language. "Why did you save me on Kellarden?" Tomas leaned on the rail, bandaged hands awkward in the moonlight, because there were children in that shuttle. He said, "Because you were one of them, because somebody had to stay by the door." She smiled then, not because the answer was soft, but because it was exact. There it was again. The human truth beneath all the ceremony, not destiny, not grandeur. Just the stubborn refusal to leave strangers behind. The Empire changed after that because it no longer had the excuse of ignorance. The thresholds were dismantled. Frontier guilds gained direct representation. Maintenance archives were raised to the status of military doctrine. Succession law was rewritten, so buried infrastructure could never again be hidden behind bloodline vanity. And children on outer stations learned the name of a human not because he conquered an alien throne, but because he stood beside one and forced it to become worth saving. No one understood at first why the princess protected one human. Then the truth came out. And after that, the better question was why the rest of the Empire had not protected him sooner.